Good evening, Beckett. It's your friend Sophia here. I'm going to read a few bedtime stories for you. But first, thank you. Thank you. The first book is Where the Wild Things Are. Where the Wild Things Are, story and pictures by Maurice Sendak. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." And so he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until the ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through the night and day. And in and out of weeks, and almost over a year, to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars, and gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes, and showed their terrible claws. Till Max said, "Be still," and then tamed them with the magic trick of staring into all their yellow eyes without blinking once, and they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all. And made him king of all wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." They're dancing at the moon, climbing trees together. Oh, he's king. "Now stop," Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around, from far away, across the world, he smelled good things to eat, so he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars, and gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes, and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye. And sailed back over a year, and in and out of weeks, and through a day. And into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. Our next book is How the Moon Regained Her Shape. How the Moon Regained Her Shape by Janet Ruth Eller and illustrated by Ben Hodson. Once the moon was round and full, proud of her gentle light. She did not fear the darkness around her. She danced across the sky, laughing as she twirled her skirts. But one day she danced across the face of the sun. The earth darkened, and the sun spoke angrily to the moon. "You ugly scarecrow, people on earth need me to grow their crops, but no one needs you. Get out of my way." The moon stopped dancing and blushed, very red. "I'm sorry," she stammered. She slowly drifted away from the sun. The moon tried to start dancing again, but the sun's words tormented her. Her arms and legs seemed too heavy to twirl. She felt very alone in the heavens. She slowly walked along her sky path, hanging her head. Her body began to shrink until she was just a sliver of her former self. A comet saw the dwindling moon dragging herself across the sky. The comet worried about his friend. "I will go to visit the moon," he decided. When the comet found out why the moon had gotten smaller, he told his friend, "There is a woman on Earth named Round Arms who can restore you to health. She lives at the foot of a mountain." The comet gave the moon directions to the woman's home. The moon trudged to the mountain where Round Arms lived. By the time she reached Round Arms, the moon was nearly invisible. Round Arms came to the door of her hut to greet the moon. She was a big woman with long, dark braids and bronze skin. Her brown eyes gleamed. "Welcome, Sister Moon. You look cold and tired. Come into my home for some tea." Excuse me, I'm going to have some too. The tea tasted like mint and ginger, and the moon felt refreshed. She told Round Arms about the sun's taunt. Round Arms gently hugged the moon and dried her tears. "The sun has a bad temper and sometimes speaks cruel words. Hold my hand, and I will take you where you can hear what those who love you are saying." Round Arms led the moon to the home of Painted Deer, the artist. Painted Deer was drawing a picture of a forest at night. "I miss the moon," he said. "The light of the moon makes the forest dreamlike and beautiful, and that's what I want to paint." The moon smiled and began to hold up her head. Then Round Arms took the moon to a rabbit hole. A mother rabbit was feeding her two bunnies. "I wish the moon would come back," the mother whispered. "In her moonbeams we can romp safely and find the corn and sunflowers that Painted Deer has left for us." The moon laughed and grew larger. Then Round Arms took the moon to a field where 100 women danced and sang. "We sing to the moon, our sister, who pulls the seas to the sands, who changes her shape like a magician, who lights our path at night. Return to the sky, our sister, for we miss your gentle beams and your loving smile." Round Arms and the moon joined the woman's dance. After the dance ended, the woman gave the moon a beaded necklace, and the moon gave them tiny bells in return. Her eyes sparkling with joy, Round Arms hugged the moon again. "I will return to the sky, Round Arms. I will never forget what I have learned. The sun has his job and his admirers, and I have my job and my friends." The moon danced and sang all the way back to her sky path. Now whenever someone insults her and she dwindles, she remembers her good friends on earth. Then the moon regains her strength and fullness. Stay strong, Beckett Moon. And our last book is Good Night, Moon, by Margaret Wise Brown and pictures by Clement Hurd. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon, and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon, and there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs. And 2 little kittens and a pair of mittens, and a little toy house and a young mouse. And a comb and a brush and a bowl full of mush, and a quiet old lady who was whispering, "Hush." Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, light and the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens, and good night, mittens. Good night, clocks, and good night, socks. Good night, little house, and good night, mouse. Good night, comb, and good night, brush. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. And good night to the old lady whispering, "Hush." Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. Now, if you remember, I said I was going to read you 3 books, but I have a little surprise for you. I'm going to read you a few poems from Shel Silverstein's Everything on It. Growing Down. Mix a grunt and a grumble, a sneer and a frown, and what do you have? Why, old Mr. Brown, the crabbiest man in our whole darn town. We all called him Grow Up Brown. For years, each girl and boy and pup heard grow up, oh, grow up. He'd say, why don't you be polite? Why must you shout and fuss and fight? Why can't you keep dirt off your clothes? Why can't you remember to wipe your nose? Why must you always make such noise? Why don't you pick up your toys? Why do you hate to wash your hands? Why are your shoes all filled with sand? Why must you shout when I'm lying down? Why don't you grow up? Grumped, Grow Up Brown. One day we said to Grow Up Brown, hey, why don't you try growing down? Why don't you crawl on your knees? Why don't you try climbing trees? Why don't you bang it on a tin can drum? Why don't you chew some bubble gum? Why don't you play kick the can? Why don't you not wash your hands? Why don't you join the baseball team? Why don't you jump and yell and scream? Why don't you try skipping stones? Why don't you eat ice cream cones? Why don't you cry when you feel sad? Why don't you cuddle with your dad? Why don't you have weenie roasts? Why don't you believe in ghosts? Why don't you have pillow fights? Why don't you sleep with your teddy at night? Why don't you swing from monkey bars? Why don't you wish on falling stars? Why don't you run in 3-legged races? Why don't you make weirdy faces? Why don't you smile, Grow Up Brown? Why don't you try growing down? Then Grow Up Brown, he scrunched and frowned and scratched his head and walked around. And finally he said with a helpless sound, maybe I will try growing down. So Grow Up Brown began to sing and started doing silly things. He started making weirdy faces and came in first in the three-legged races. All day he swung from monkey bars. At night he'd lie and count the stars. He tooted horns. He banged on drums. He spent $20 on bubble gum. He went to all the weenie roasts, and once he thought he saw a ghost. He got to be great at pillow fights, and he went to sleep with his teddy at night. He flew a kite, he kicked a can, he rubbed some dirt upon his hands. He drew some pictures, threw some stones, ate 47 ice cream cones. He got some sand between his toes, got a loose tooth and a bloody nose. He got a dog, they rolled in the mud. He imitated Elmer Fudd. He climbed a roof, though no one asked. He broke his wrist, he wore a cast. He rolled down hills, he climbed trees. He scuffed his elbows, skinned his knees. He tried to join the baseball team. When they said no, he spit and screamed. He cried when he was feeling sad, and he went and cuddled with his dad. He wore a hat that didn't fit. He learned just how far he could spit. He learned to wrestle and get tickled, sucked his thumb and belched and giggled. He got his trousers torn and stained. He ran out barefoot in the rain, shouting to all the folks in town, it's much more fun, this growing down. I just love that one. Okay, this next one. Holding. We can't hold hands, someone might see. Won't you please hold toes with me? Had to keep that one in. Had to read that one. Fred's heads. Fred's heads, that's what the sign said. Want a new head? Come see Fred. Find the head that fits you best. Leave your own with all the rest. Try on one of sunny smiles. Wear this one that cries a while. Here's one that whistles and winks. Here's one that frowns and thinks. How about this one that grins? When you find it's wearing thin, bring it back and trade it in. Henry Hall. Henry Hall moved here last fall. Henry Hall is strong and tall. Henry Hall outjumps us all. Give Henry Hall the basketball, he'd rip the basket off the wall. The others all would surely fall when Henry Hall would shoot the ball. We'd win 'em all with Henry Hall, but Henry Hall hates basketball. P.S. The one in the hat is Henry Hall. The one on the left is Clumsy Paul. We hardly let him play at all. Rude Rudy Reese. Rude Rudy Reese, Rude Rudy Reese. He never said thank you, and never said please. He'd yell, give me a quarter, or cook me some peas, or pass the salt, but he never said please. One day, down the mountain, he came on his skis, yelling, clear me a path, but he never said please. So he bounced off the rocks and got caught in trees, yelling, help me down, but he didn't say please. So he tried climbing down, but he slipped on some leaves, yelling, catch me someone, but he didn't say please. So he fell in some poo right up to his knees, yelling, quick, pull me out, but he didn't say please. Then he got attacked by some low-flying geese. We'd have shooed him away, but he didn't say please. So he sunk to his chin, then along came some bees. He screamed, throw me a rope, but he didn't say please. Then along came a reptile from out of the seas. He thought, Lord, save me now, but he didn't think please. So the reptile ate him with crackers and cheese. We'd have passed him the salt, but he didn't say please. Okay. What is the last poem? When I am gone. When I am gone, what will you do? Who will write and draw for you? Someone smarter, someone new. Someone better, maybe, you. That concludes our read-along. Beckett, I hope you enjoyed Where the Wild Things Are, How the Moon Regained Her Shape, and of course, Good Night Moon, and a little extra. Happy birthday, Beckett. Good night. Yeah.